All right, let's dive into microservices. This is a really powerful and super popular way of building the complex software that, we use every single day. And at its core, it's a pretty simple idea. You just break these huge, massive problems down into small, manageable pieces.
I mean, have you ever wondered why updating just one tiny little feature in your favorite app can take weeks? You've probably felt that frustration, right? A simple button change, a tiny bug fix, and it takes forever to get to your phone. Well, the reason usually isn't the feature itself. It's the hidden complexity of how the application was built. And that, right there, is the exact problem microservices are designed to solve.
So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll look at the old way of doing things, the age of the monolith. Then we'll jump into a new way to build, see how microservices actually work, understand the all-important API layer, and finally, we'll weigh the pros and cons.
Okay, so to really appreciate why microservices are such a big deal, we have to travel back in time a little bit, to the age of the monolith. For a long time, this was the standard way to build pretty much everything.
So what is a monolith? Well, a monolithic application is built as one single giant unit. The user interface, all the business logic, the data access, everything is just crammed together, packaged into one massive, interconnected block of code.
The best analogy for a monolith is a really, really tangled ball of yarn. Seriously, because everything is so tightly interconnected, making a change in just one tiny part can have totally unpredictable consequences somewhere else. You pull on one string, and the whole thing just gets knotted up. It makes updates super risky and incredibly slow.
And that risk, that slowness, that's exactly what pushed developers to think differently. They started looking for a new way to build, a way to finally untangle that giant ball of yarn.
Yep, and this visual here shows that journey perfectly. You can see we move from that single monolithic block over to an architecture made of smaller, independent pieces. That's microservices. So instead of one giant application, you've got a whole collection of small services all working together.
Okay, so let's really break down that difference. With a monolith, you've got one huge code base. If you want to update anything, you have to deploy the entire application all at once, and everything usually shares one single giant database. But with microservices, well, you have many small focused services. Each one can be deployed totally independently, and, this is crucial, each service manages its own separate database. All right, so we've seen the what. Now let's get into the how. How do all these independent little pieces actually come together to form a working application?
So check this out. This diagram lays out the entire structure for us. At the very top, you've got client requests. That's you using the app on your phone. Now, you don't talk to the services directly. No way. Instead, all those requests go through this central API layer, which is kind of like a traffic controller. We'll talk more about it in a bit, but its main job is to direct your request to the correct independent service, and you can see each of those services has its own dedicated database.
Now, the key concept that makes all of this possible is something called bounded context. This is really the core philosophy here. It just means that each service is completely self-contained. It's responsible for one single business function, like, say, handling user profiles or processing payments. It has all the information it needs to do its job, and it doesn't need to depend on other services. And this leads to a really counterintuitive idea. In programming, you're always taught, don't repeat yourself, right? Never duplicate code. But with microservices, independence is so important that it's often better to duplicate a small piece of code in two different services than it is to force those two services to depend on each other. You actually prefer duplication to coupling. Kind of wild, huh? And this idea of breaking things apart, it doesn't just stop with the code on the server. It goes all the way to what you actually see on your screen. So on the left, you've got the old way, a single monolithic user interface. But look at the right. That's a micro front end. Here, even the UI is built from independent components, and each one lines up with the services running behind the scenes.
But let's be real. None of these services could ever work together without the system's unsung hero. It's traffic cop, the API layer.
Think of the API layer as the single front door for the entire system. Your app doesn't need to know or care where the user profile service is or where the payment service lives. Nope. It just makes a request to the API layer, and that layer hides all that complexity. It just presents this one, single, unified interface to the outside world.
And man, this layer is busy. It's doing at least 5 big jobs. First, it's the gateway, that front door we talked about. Second, it handles routing, making sure your request gets to the right service. Third, it's the security guard.
handling authentication and authorization. Fourth, it can act as a data assembler, aggregating info from multiple services to give you one clean response. And finally, it does load balancing, making sure no single service gets totally overwhelmed with traffic.
But of course, no architecture is perfect. There's no silver bullet, and microservices definitely come with a very specific and very important set of trade-offs.
This ratings chart gives us a fantastic snapshot of those trade-offs. Just look at the top. 5 stars across the board for deployability, scalability, and modularity. That's huge. It means it's easy to update, it can handle massive amounts of traffic, and the code stays nice and organized. But then you look at the bottom. Yikes. Performance, overall cost, and simplicity, they take a major hit.
So, there it is. That's the key trade-off. On the one hand, you get this incredible flexibility. Your teams can work independently, they can choose their own tech stacks, and they can deploy updates whenever they want. What's the cost? Well, having all those services talking to each other over a network can be slower, and managing such a complex system, it's definitely more difficult and a lot more expensive.
So, why would anyone make this trade-off? Well, the big takeaway here is that microservices are built for the intense demands of the modern world. They prioritize speed, not just performance speed, but the speed of your organization to get things done. They prioritize flexibility to evolve and change. And they prioritize resilience so that if one little piece fails, it doesn't bring the whole thing crashing down.
It really makes you think of software in a new way, right? Not as this single, static thing, but as a dynamic collection of building blocks. And that leaves us with a pretty exciting question. If we can now build these incredibly complex systems one piece at a time, what are we going to build next?